Order, order. Good morning. Welcome everyone to our first committee since the parliamentary recess, and welcome to our witnesses from Ofqual. For the benefit of the tape and those listening outside, could I ask the witnesses to very briefly introduce themselves and their title? And could I just check, are you happy with first names during this session? If you could just nod. Thank you. Can we start with you, Roger, please, if you just introduce yourself.
I'm Roger Taylor. I'm the chair of Ofqual. And just to say, Mr. Chairman, if you direct questions to me, I will then, if necessary, ask my colleagues, Julie and Michelle, to address aspects that they would be better able to answer.
Julie?
Good morning, Julie Swan. I'm Executive Director of General Qualifications at Ofqual.
And who I can't see. Is it just, where is Michelle? Michelle, there you are, Michelle.
Good morning, I'm Michelle Meadows. I'm Executive Director for Strategy, Risk and Research.
Thank you. And Dame Glenys, do you want to introduce yourself, although you're not answering questions today?
Good morning. Thank you for that opportunity. My name's Dame Glenys Stacey. I was very recently appointed as Acting Chief Regulator at Ofqual.
Thank you. And would you like to be addressed as Dame Glenys or Glenys?
I'd be happy to call Glenys or Dame Glenys. I'll answer either. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for coming as well today. And I wish you well in your new position.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, can I just urge you all to give concise answers, and we will mostly direct questions at individuals, or we might say, Chair or Roger, can you answer this, or can Julie or Michelle answer these questions? But to be as concise as possible, because we have quite a bit to get through today. We received your statement last night. Just to let you know, the committee will publish that statement in the next 15 minutes or so. Thank you for sending that. Obviously, I've got to look at the statement very carefully, but my first reading of it suggests that what Ofqual is saying is that you did everything that ministers asked you to do, that the algorithm you think was fair despite the anomalies, and actually what went wrong was because pupils and families and teachers wouldn't accept the grades because in essence they hadn't done an exam. So what you're really saying in 3 words, if I had to describe it in a nutshell, is not me, Gov. Is that a fair reflection of the statement, Chair?
I think as we made clear in the statement, we fully accept our share of responsibility for what has gone wrong this year. I have personally apologised to students and parents for what has been, we recognise, an extremely anxiety-making incident. It has been disruptive to this year's candidates. It has been disruptive to higher education. It has been disruptive to next year's candidates.
Yeah, no, thank you. You say that in your statement, but just specifically, is my summary of the statement accurate in your view?
That what we would point towards is that the fundamental mistake was to believe that this would ever be acceptable to the public. And perhaps I might illustrate that point, give a sense of what I mean by that, which is that we were looking at this in terms of particular ideas of fairness across a whole population, the probability that somebody would get a grade, but acknowledging from the outset that it would not be anything like as accurate as exams. I think what we now realize is that if you imagine, if you have 1,000 students that have, for example, an 80% chance of getting an A grade, they would regard themselves quite reasonably as A grade students. What we were doing, in effect, was to recognize that in a normal year, 200 of those students would fail to get their A grade. They would go and exam, and it just wouldn't happen on the day, and they would get a B grade.
Okay.
We were using statistics and teacher rankings in order to...
Okay, in the statement you say there is no evidence of bias, but we know that larger institutions such as sixth form colleges and FE colleges were disadvantaged by the algorithm, and those institutions are more likely to educate those from lower socio-economic backgrounds. Is it not extraordinary for your statement to say we knew about this but were unable to find a solution to this problem. So if you knew about it, why didn't you ask for help?
We did know about it. It's important to say that given the choice between standardizing and not standardizing, the impact is better for students from lower socioeconomic statuses with the standardized results. That is why we felt that despite the known issues with small centres, and again, the same is true of private schools, it did give an advantage to private schools, that the inability to standardise small cohorts, but it is also true that overall, the process of standardisation reduced the advantage enjoyed by private schools. That is why we felt it was fairer to use the standardisation process than as a mechanism to ensure the greatest possible fairness in the circumstances. We do acknowledge that the level of fairness achieved was not felt to be acceptable, but it did improve the level of fairness that
well, if I could just turn to the relationship between the Department for Education and Ofqual, we know that on the 31st of March, the Secretary of State issued a direction asking Ofqual to mandate the method of calculating final grades and develop an appeal process for GCSE, AS and A levels, as well as vocational qualifications. And on 15th of August 2020, we saw Ofqual publish criteria by which mock exam grades could be used in the appeal process and then subsequently retracted. The DfE had also said that the distribution of grades should follow a similar profile to that in previous years. On the 19th of August, a DfE statement implied that Ofqual took the decision to allow pupils to use centre-assessed grades, and the decision was, and I quote, one that the department agreed with. And what these events show is that there perhaps isn't just one clear authority making the final decision. So could I ask you, Roger, to clarify in simple terms, what is the official legal relationship between the DfE and Ofqual, and what authority each institution had for which of the major decisions that were taken?
Certainly. The relationship is one in which the Secretary of State, as the democratically accountable politician, decides policy. Ofqual's role is to have regard to policy and to implement policy, but within the constraints laid down by the statute that established Ofqual. And those constraints are that the awarding of grades must be valid, it must be maintain standards from year on year, and it must command public confidence. So we can decide not to implement a direction from the Secretary of State if we feel that it would directly contradict those statutory duties. But if policy does not directly contradict those statutory duties, our obligation is then to implement policy as directed by the Secretary of State.
So who had the authority for which decisions when it came to the development of the standardised model algorithm and which grade should be used? And at what point precisely was the decision made on 15th of August, that Saturday, to retract the statement on mock exam results in appeals? And who took that decision?
So if I perhaps walk through from the beginning, because there's an important relationship in terms of Ofqual, the other duty Ofqual has is to offer advice to ministers. So at the outset, our initial advice to the Secretary of State was that the best way to handle this was to try to hold exams in a socially distanced manner, that our second option was to delay exams, but the third option, if neither of these was acceptable, would be to have to try and look at some form of calculated grade. We did also look at whether that might be a teacher certificate rather than attempting to replicate exam grades. That was our advice to ministers. It was the Secretary of State who then subsequently took the decision and announced, without further consultation with Ofqual, that exams were to be cancelled and that a system of calculated grades was to be implemented. We then received a direction from the Secretary of State setting out what he wished Ofqual to implement. At that point, it becomes our responsibility to decide how to implement this in terms of the design of the algorithm that was used to standardise results in line with the direction of the Secretary of State.
So you took the decisions entirely when it came to the development of the algorithm?
That is correct.
Right. And in terms of the 15th of August, the retraction of the statement, you put out a statement in the afternoon on the Saturday,
yes,
and then by late Saturday night it had gone. Who made that decision?
So again, just to walk you through the series of decisions there, the Secretary of State informed us that he was minded to implement that effectively they were going to change policy. Until that point, the policy had been calculated grades plus an appeals process. The Secretary of State informed me that they were planning to change this policy in a very significant way by allowing an entirely new mechanism by which a grade could be awarded through a mock exams appeal. Our advice to the Secretary of State at this point was that we could not be confident that this could be delivered within the statutory duties of Ofqual to ensure that valid and trustworthy grades were being issued. The Secretary of State, as he is entitled to do, nonetheless announced that that was the policy of the government. That having been announced as the policy of the government, the Ofqual board felt, I think correctly, that we should therefore attempt to find a way to implement this in a way that was consistent with our statutory duties. We consulted very rapidly with exam boards and other key stakeholders. We were very concerned that this idea of a valid mock exam had no real credible meaning, but we consulted very rapidly and developed an approach that we felt would be consistent with awarding valid qualifications. We then agreed that with the Department for Education and, to our understanding, with the Secretary of State's office. We then published this on the Saturday. We were subsequently contacted by the Secretary of State later that evening and were informed that this was in fact not, to his mind, in line with government policy.
At what time were you contacted?
So it was published about 3 o'clock on the Saturday. I think the call from the Secretary of State was probably at around 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock that evening. The Secretary of State first phoned the Chief Regulator. The Chief Regulator explained that this decision had been made by the board, had been made on what I think were extremely sound principles, and that therefore she could not, as it were, take down the statement or reverse the policy. The Secretary of State phoned me and said that he would like the board to reconsider. I did again reiterated what struck me as the very clear arguments as to why this was the right way to implement this policy, and that to do otherwise would have been inconsistent with awarding of valid and reliable grades. Nonetheless, given that the Secretary of State's views, it felt appropriate to call the board together very late that evening. The board convened at, I think, around 10 o'clock that evening. And I think at this stage, we realized that we were in a situation which was rapidly getting out of control, that there were policies being recommended and strongly advocated by the Secretary of State that we felt would not be consistent with our legal duties, and that there was additionally a growing risk around delivering any form of mock appeals result in a way that would be acceptable as a reasonable way to award grades. The issue here being simply that this was looking increasingly like it was going to result in 85, 90% of candidates receiving a centre-assessed grade in effect, but potentially a small number not receiving them because they did not have access to this route. Furthermore, it would take time to make this happen, and that therefore there was a risk to candidates' university places, and there was furthermore an increasing risk about the deliverability of it. So for these reasons, we felt that we are now in a situation that was moving rapidly out of control, and that it was likely that the only way out of this was to move towards centre-assessed grades.
Right, but when you put it up on your website, did you not agree it with the department first before you put that information up?
Yes, and with the Secretary of State's office.
But so before the information went up on the website on the Saturday, the 15th of August in the afternoon, you agreed that, you put it up on your website, and what you're saying is the Secretary of State called you and asked you to change that information. Right. Why did you then put on the website that we've taken the information down, where the board will be considering options? Why didn't you give a fuller explanation of what was going on?
Because we felt we needed to reconvene and discuss further with the Secretary of State the options that were available. The three options that were then available were to implement the mock appeals route as the Secretary of State envisioned it, to go back to the situation that we had originally proposed, which was a mock appeals route that was consistent with centre-assessed grades, or the third option was simply to move to centre-assessed grades. At this point, it was clear that to have given any clearer guidance without having had an opportunity to discuss these issues further with the Secretary of State and try to move towards what we felt was a policy that would be fairest to students and most likely to deliver results in good time and order.
Right. So by a couple of days later, the decision was made for the U-turn to accept the centre assessed grades.
There were discussions throughout the Sunday, and on the Sunday evening, Ofqual took the decision that there was no way to pursue this in any orderly, reasonable manner that would deliver fair grades for students.
Right. So on Saturday night, the appeal system was going, on the Saturday the 15th, the appeal system was going to be widened to include mocks. As we know, it was put on your website, then the Secretary of State calls, you say you can't do this, and so by Sunday, 24 hours later, that's why the move was made to centre assessed grades. Is that what you're saying? Is that correct? Right. Can I just ask you, I will bring in my colleagues soon, but did Ofqual challenge the DFE, the Department for Education, on any decisions made by the department during the development of the algorithm?
So
and also in terms of the request of the Department for Education to avoid grade inflation and have it like previous years and so on.
We initially advised against cancelling exams. With regard to the maintenance of standards and the design of the algorithm, that was a process of continuous collaboration. We felt that this was not like other years. It was not that we were regulating the independent awarding of grades by exam boards. We were effectively constructing together with the department and the exam boards a national system to determine how grades were to be awarded. It was therefore would not have been appropriate to do anything except involve them very closely in all decision making. And there was indeed a programme board that oversaw this that involved both the exam boards, Ofqual and the Department for Education. So
but before I carry on, I'm going to bring in Tom Hunt and Jonathan Gooders very quickly, and I'll carry on, and then I'll bring in my other colleagues because they have some quick questions relevant. Tom Hunt.
It's just a point about how when Ofqual takes positions, it does take into account whether or not it can secure broad public support. I mean, can you understand why some of us find it odd and strange, hard to believe how anyone could think that something would so penalise state schools compared to private schools, when you have a rule that class sizes below 15, greater weight for the CAGs than in larger classes, and that did feed through to it's a very significant increase in the number of A stars and A's for private schools, but not for comprehensive schools. Don't you find it? Do you agree with us that it's hard for us to really understand how anyone could ever think that would secure broad public support?
Okay, just a brief answer if you can, please.
So I'd just like to reiterate, the standardisation process did reduce the advantage enjoyed by private schools. It's important to say that. But on your broader point, from the very outset, we said that it's an enormously difficult thing to do in a way that will command public support. However, we have to have due regard for government policy. If the minister decides that this is the policy that the government wishes to pursue, there are very good reasons for this policy. The policy ensures greater fairness in the sense that you have less variation in your grades between centres. It ensures greater fairness in terms of that next year's candidates would not be affected by this result. It ensures greater fairness in the sense that it does result in less disadvantage for disadvantaged communities.
Thank you. Jonathan Gullis. And briefly, please.
Yeah, no, thank you, Chair. Again, sorry, thank you, Roger. I would like to understand, what did Ofqual do once it had seen what happened in Scotland regarding standardisation and the algorithm? Did you not take into account what happened in Scotland and therefore make adjustments?
Perhaps two comments to say about this. The first thing was that the initial response in Scotland was driven by a view that it had unfairly penalised disadvantaged communities. And as I have said, we were confident that our approach was not unfairly penalising disadvantaged communities. The second thing to say about this is that the decision to change policy on the basis that there was no public confidence was obviously something that ministers would need to agree with. It was on that day that the Secretary of State decided that the government's response in terms of policy adjustment in relation to Scotland would be to introduce this new form of appeal based on mock grades. Our advice was that this was an extremely risky thing to do because we were very unclear how it could be delivered in a way that was consistent with Ofqual's legal duties.
Okay, David Johnston, briefly, before I carry on, and then I'll...
Thanks, Chair. There are various aspects of this that have the feel of a slow-moving car crash, and one of them is about high-attaining children at low-performing schools. Now, you did identify this would be an issue. You thought it affected about 0.2% of young people, but you said it was too difficult to identify them. My question is, did you consider asking schools to identify them, because they're very used to doing so for university references and so on? And even if you could have resolved all these issues in the appeals process, you must have realised the distress it would cause on results day, even if you could resolve every single one of those cases, which itself is questionable.
Thank you for the question. Yes, it was, as you can imagine, a question that absorbed a lot of our time and our thinking, and we had run a number of mechanisms for identifying candidates. And as you say, one of the mechanisms was indeed to use the information from the centre assessed grades, in the sense that a school that had, on the whole, did not present very inflated grades, but had one student that was performing very differently from the rest of the cohort, was a signal that this was indeed occurring. It was clear that to make a valid judgment would require a degree of human judgment, and that therefore a form of appeal would be necessary to make this work. But we were also exploring with the exam boards how we could implement a system of outreach to those students through the exam boards to let them know on the day, look, we think you've probably got a very good case for appeal. So that was the direction we were moving in. When the mock appeals route came in, that question became less relevant.
Could I just challenge you on the situation in terms of disadvantaged students? You say in your letter that your model didn't disadvantage students. The Department for Education confirmed on the 14th of August that pupils from lower socio-economic groups were more likely than their peers to have their centre assessed grades downgraded by Ofqual's algorithm at grades C and above. The difference between Ofqual's moderated grades and teacher centre assessed grades for lower socio-economic groups was 10.42%, and in contrast, the difference between Ofqual's moderated grade and teacher centre assessed grade for higher socio-economic groups was 8.34%. So did Ofqual identify these as potential issues at any point, and did you raise these issues with ministers, and what was their response? I'm very happy if one of the other witnesses answers, Chair, if you feel that's necessary.
I might hand over to Michelle here, but just to say, I think that is the interpretation of the figure, the correct interpretation of figures, is that the moderation process gave strong candidates from disadvantaged communities a better relative outcome than the unmoderated results. But I'll hand over to Michelle.
Okay, just before you answer, Michelle, if I could just add, because we know the private schools benefited from this, can you explain what was meant by the exclusion of data with respect to, can I quote from the publication, your report on the algorithm that you published after the results were issued? You say that the exclusion of data with respect to learners registered with independent selective centres. What was sought to be achieved by this exclusion?
If I take that question first, and then I'll come back to the question about the changes to the centre assessment grades. So we use the National Pupil Database as our source of data. Often for certain centre types, independent schools, the data is patchier. So we can come back with a full detailed response to your question, but it will be that that data wasn't available for that particular centre type, but we'll come back with full technical detail for you. On the question of the changes to the centre assessment grades by socioeconomic status, of course, what really counts is the final grade that a student walks away with. That's what actually impacts their life chances. And we had done a full equalities analysis looking at the grades, not just by socioeconomic status, but by other protected characteristics such as ethnicity, gender, and so on. And what we were able to see, and we were very confident about, was that any fluctuation in outcomes that we're seeing for these various groups this year was extremely similar to small changes in outcomes that we've seen in previous years. So in other words, there was nothing about the process that was biased.
Right. So, as I understand it, you developed 11 algorithms and tested them using 2019 data. Is that right?
There are 11 or 12 algorithms in total that were tested, yes.
So schools and colleges were asked to submit their grades, centre assessed grades, by 12th of June 2020. Is that correct?
I believe so. I'd have to check the exact date.
Why then did Ofqual not use the time between 12th of June 2020 and the 13th of August A-level results to test the algorithms using a sample of data from 2020 and compare it with the centre assessed grades, rather than wait until the 11th hour to realise the algorithm produced discrepancies? Perhaps some of the wild anomalies that sixth form ecologists saw would surely have become apparent much sooner. In essence, what I'm asking is, should you have done your own mock exam in terms of the algorithm?
So we tested the model thoroughly. We tested, as you say, 11, 12 different approaches in total. We tested the impact on different centre types, centres with different proportions of candidates from different ethnicities, socioeconomic status, and so on. We were confident that the model that we chose was most accurate overall and the most accurate for those different groups of students. We didn't do this in isolation.
No, but did you do a dummy run, in essence, to check out what the anomalies were on all the students before the actual final version of it? So that you would have, if you'd have done that, you might have been able to pick out and sort out the problems that then came about.
Well, perhaps if I could jump in here just to say, we were obviously aware of this, and throughout June we're looking at these issues, and indeed there were ongoing discussions about different ways of defining what an anomaly was. There were two issues that we were considering during that period, one of which is, was there a mechanism by which we could apply additional rules, overlay additional rules to address these in advance of awarding? And I think it was very clear, and the legal advice on this was extremely clear, that that would involve us making arbitrary judgments that would not be justified.
And did you raise the predictive accuracy of the model with ministers? Were the risks of the model raised with the Department for Education?
Throughout the process, yes. I might hand over to Julie perhaps to say a little bit more about that. I just wanted to make one further point, which was that these issues that you were talking about, the resultant, the mechanism we realised was the best way to deal with it was through the appeals process, and it led to the guidance on appeals that was issued that made clear that even an individual outlying candidate would be able to make an appeal on the grounds that standardisation had adversely affected them. But perhaps
so just on your external advisory group, who was on it? How was it appointed? And did you ask expert outside external representatives to make sure that the model was fair? And if one of you could just answer that as well briefly, please.
Michelle answered that one, and perhaps Julie could come back to your earlier question as well about informing the department about the risks. But Michelle, do you want to address the question about the external advice?
Yeah, sure. So we had 10 different members of the external advisory group. Actually, only one of those members worked within an organisation associated with the exam board, somebody from Cambridge Assessment. The rest were from external organisations, including Ofsted, UCAS, Oxford University, independent consultants, and so on. They were chosen to have a blend of statistical and assessment expertise.
Right, but not the Royal Statistical Society.
We did have a member who was associated with the Royal Statistical Society. Indeed, he's a member of the Education Policy Group.
As you know, they're not very happy because they feel that they offered a lot of help, and that was you imposed such stringent conditions that it was impossible for them to do so. Can I just ask you, are you going to make all the minutes just to promote transparency? Will you publish all the communications and minutes you've had with the department?
Yes, I think we can do that. Subject, obviously, would need to discuss with the department if there's any form of deliberative privilege they would wish to execute. We certainly don't have anything to hide, but obviously it's not. But I don't think it's appropriate for us to simply say we will publish correspondence with them without further.
And finally, before I bring in my colleagues, apart from the issue you've talked about on the Saturday night, what discussions and meetings did you have with the department between A-level results day on the 13th of August and the government's announcement that centre assessed grades would stand on the 17th of August?
So Julie, I might hand over to you for the just to refer to the full record, but we had conversations on the day before with both Sally and I had conversations with I certainly had a conversation with the Secretary of State and a number of conversations with policy advisors to the Secretary of State. We fed back our concerns about the proposal and the issues that we felt would be necessary to make it implementable.
And what did the Secretary of State on the Sunday, having defended the system, but the government defended the system for the previous days before on the 16th of August, what did the Secretary of State say on the Sunday to you, that he was accepting that there would be a U-turn? Is that right?
By the end of the day, we had a number of conversations on that day. I think by the end of the day, he had come to accept and recognise that Ofqual, the situation was now one that would, if any other policy, would simply be indefensible, and that we had to make that decision. And he did say, if we made that decision, that we would then work collaboratively to try and implement it.
So I'm going to bring in Caroline Johnson briefly, and then Ian Mearns and David Simmons. Okay, Caroline Johnson. If you just unmute yourself.
Thank you, Chair. My question is, we know that 75% of young people taking the exams would not have, under ordinary circumstances, achieved their grade that they were predicted in some subjects. Do you think on that basis, therefore, that the mistake was in cancelling exams? Because once the exams have been cancelled, realistically, any statistical process that you made was always going to leave people disappointed and not meet your requirement of broad public support.
I think that is exactly right. And we did say right at the outset, the risk here is statistical prediction is simply not accurate enough, and that there would definitely be a candidate who would know that they would have done better in the exam, but who would be given a result lower than what they reasonably and confidently felt that they could do in an exam. When the decision was originally made, there was a strong belief that the autumn series would be the compensation for that people would be given a chance, and that university places could be held open for them that they could take in January, and that this would limit that damage. That at the time, it felt that this was a fair offer. But of course, over time, schools didn't reopen. There were no arrangements for late entry to university. And by July, it was clear that the autumn series did not represent any sort of reasonable alternative that candidates felt would make up for being given an inaccurate calculated grade. And at that point, I think we were in a situation where it was very difficult to see how people would accept this as a fair way to have their grades awarded.
Ian Mearns.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Roger, you started off this morning by saying that you've already apologised and that you apologised again, but I'm afraid to say that, given the huge amount of information and sort of really dreadful stories that we've had directly from students, their parents, from their centres, I'm afraid that in this context, an apology really doesn't cut the mustard. And Michelle, in answering an earlier question about how we got here, you said you tested the model thoroughly, but the trouble is you tested the model thoroughly and ended up here, and you couldn't see that you were going to end up here and what the ramifications of ending up here were going to be. The fact that you couldn't see that, from my perspective, given the fact that you're a public body overseeing this sort of process, is in itself a huge problem. That you couldn't see that there would be a huge public backlash to this whole scenario. And therefore, from that perspective, I've really got to ask the question in terms of, was the prime directive in starting this whole process to avoid what's called these days grade inflation, so that the process would be seen to be consistent with previous year's results? Because I've got a problem with that premise, and this is the problem. Ministers are regularly telling us that we've got more good and outstanding schools with the most highly professional teaching profession that we've ever had. So given that process, that improvement and that continuing improvement, should there not be some increase in the levels of achievement by youngsters on a year-on-year basis, which cannot be put down as grade inflation?
That's a very good question. Two issues there. In terms of the awareness of the difficulty of landing this mechanism in a way that the public would have confidence in, it's important to stress that Ofqual's duty is to attempt to implement government policy. There were very good reasons why standardized grades were preferable to unstandardized grades. And I don't think it would have been appropriate for Ofqual to have ignored the Secretary of State's guidance on the basis that we did not believe that it would ever be deliverable in a way the public would trust. That would have been going beyond, I think, what our reasonable behaviour of an independent regulator would be. On your point about grade inflation, we were very aware that being very strict about grade inflation would only make this situation worse. That is why in the design of the model, we at every point where we could reasonably do this, we erred in the direction of making decisions that allowed grades to rise. Consequently, the final result of the moderated grades did allow for between 2 and 3% inflation in grades, which in assessment terms is a very significant grade and would be larger than would represent the sorts of effects you're talking about that would result from improvements in teaching. But we felt was appropriate in these extremely unusual circumstances, given the disruption that had happened to people's lives as a result of the pandemic.
But Roger, I've seen also, importantly, some suggestion that if on an annual basis, all of the scripts that were marked, 6 million or so at GCSE and A level, were marked again by a senior examiner, that up to 25% of them might have their grades improved. Up to 25%, 1 in 4 might have their grades improved. And yet, you know, the number of appeals is relatively low compared to that. Now, you know, what's your comments on that? Because I believe that to be the case.
So this is a comment on the research that Ofqual has published about the it's important to understand no form of assessment is so accurate as to genuinely capture perfectly the abilities of each individual. And so what you're referring to is the research that Ofqual has been leading on in terms of accuracy. And it's important to also say in this context that the inaccuracy works both ways. It's not just, but Michelle, perhaps I could hand over to you as this is work that you have been doing.
Briefly, please.
Yeah, absolutely. Every year we publish marking consistency metrics that report the extent to which grades would change if a different senior examiner had looked at the work. And in fact, we looked at that work this year and took some comfort from it in the sense that the levels of accuracy we were seeing from the standardization model were very similar to those levels of accuracy that we see each year through the marking process.
Yeah, one last comment, Chair, before we move on, is that you know, Ofqual is and should maintain its independence, but it does seem as though the hand of the DFE and ministers has been too closely intricately involved in this whole process, when they should have been kept out of it if Ofqual is to sustain and maintain its independence in this process.
Chair?
Do you wish me to respond to that?
Yes, please.
I would say that we were in completely uncharted territory. Nobody has ever had to deal with a situation of the pandemic for as some people have said, this has been the biggest challenge to the country since the Second World War. In determining what is the acceptable way forward, I do think it is appropriate that that decision falls to democratically elected politicians. I do not think it would have been appropriate for Ofqual to have determined the fundamental policy as to how we were going to...
But basically what you've told us earlier is that in terms of the Saturday, the 15th of August, that you were reluctant you were worried about widening the appeal system in the way the government had suggested, but you still put it on your website to agree with them. Then the government ring you up late at night and tell you, actually, no, this isn't acceptable, and you do what they say and take it off.
No, sorry, just to be, I perhaps haven't explained that as clearly as I should have. We implemented the policy in a way that we felt was acceptable, and the crucial thing that we had realised was that there was the idea that there was a valid mock result. Yep. But what became very clear was that there really weren't large numbers of students who had, say, taken every paper of an examination under examination conditions, had them marked according to the mark scheme and graded appropriately, which would have been, as it were, pretty strong evidence of the grade they would have got. What people tended to have was partial evidence from various tests taken at various times. Now, we had asked the head of centre to sign off, taking into account the existing evidence from mock results, the grade that they thought the candidate was most likely to achieve. If we had then allowed the same centres to submit a partial piece of evidence and say they believed on the basis of this evidence that the candidate would have in fact achieved a higher grade, we would be inviting them to make two directly contradictory statements. And these statements were signed off by the head of centre and were extremely serious statements about the reliability of the information the centres were providing. It would have been completely irresponsible to have allowed that to occur. Therefore, the only way in which to deliver this policy sensibly was to allow centres to present.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is you still took it off your website when the Secretary of State asked you to do.
Yeah, because the Secretary of State was, I mean...
So therefore the independence of Ofqual comes into question, because you could have just said, no, I'm not taking it off the website.
It's important in trying to manage public confidence that we do not, as it were, have the Secretary of State stating one policy and Ofqual stating a different policy. It therefore felt that, and it also struck us that the way to resolve this was to move place, and that this needed to be negotiated and managed in a orderly fashion. But we were at full independence.
Okay, I'm going to bring in David Simmons, and then Tom Hunt wants a brief question. David Simmons.
Thank you, Chair. I'm one of those members whose inbox now has a lot more complaints about the consequences of the U-turn than about the original results that were published in respect of A-levels. This committee spent a lot of time looking at the fairness of exam results and the process that will be followed. And there are a couple of questions linked to each other, really, which I'd like to put to our witnesses. The first builds on the question Ian asked about the role of ministers. I just would like to hear a bit more about the degree to which assurances were sought about the risks which have been highlighted by a number of people of the alternative options and how effectively those were considered in arriving at a decision about what was the best way to proceed. Because I think it's unhelpful to have a blame game process at the moment, but it's helpful to understand how effective that process of assurance was in order to learn lessons about avoiding this kind of thing in future. The second question, just touching on something which a number of people have mentioned around the appeals process, and I know we're going to come onto that in a bit more detail later on. Do the panel feel that an appeals process in which individual students do not have a right of appeal can ever be fit for purpose? And the risk, it seems to me, is that it places institutional interest ahead of the student interest, which is reflected certainly in a lot of the complaints that I'm getting at the moment. A third and separate question, and Chair, if it's okay, I think I'll just ask these ones together. Does the panel believe that reliance on final exams is a significant weakness in the education system at the moment? Would we be better to have more alternative methods of assessment? Has this situation demonstrated a lack of resilience in our exam system? And then finally, does the panel have any comment to make about what guidance was provided to schools in putting together centre-assessed grades? I think we've heard a lot of anecdotal comment from teachers, including one who I spent a lot of time talking to about this, who was told your centre-assessed grades will have to be statistically in line with previous year's results. So even if you think you've got 3 A-star students in your given cohort, if you got 1 A-star last year, only one of them is allowed to have an A-star. Now, I've not been able to find that reflected in any guidance that was provided to schools, but that seems to have been quite a common issue that's been cited by head teachers and teachers as an expectation that they felt they were under, which clearly is again an issue that goes to the heart of fairness. So perhaps if I could ask you those questions, the assurance, the point about the appeals process, the fairness of the lack of student right to do that, the reliance on final exams versus other methods of assessment, and then that point about guidance.
So I'll take the first three, and Julie, if I could hand over to you, particularly on the last of those, but I'll give you initial answers. So in terms of the assurance around the original decision, I mean, we put our advice into the Department for Health. As I say, our advice was try and run the exams in a socially distanced way. Secondly, delay the exams, or the worst case scenario is this calculated grades. And if we are going down that route, it would be worth considering whether a teacher certificate, rather than attempt to replicate grades in a way through a system that really was not a replication of that system, should also be considered. The decision obviously then is a political decision, and you would need, I think, to talk to departmental officials and to ministers to understand exactly the process that was gone through. An announcement was then made 2 days later saying that exams were going to be cancelled, and the process as we know it was launched. But I can't talk in any more detail about specifically how that decision was made. On the appeal...
May I just, Chair, if I may just explore that a little bit more. So you said essentially your advice was that calculated grades were the worst case scenario. Did ministers or government come back to you and say, let's understand the risks with calculated grades versus deferral of examinations versus the other options that might have been out there?
I might refer to Michelle and Julie just to say about the discussions. I mean, the paper that was presented at the time does list in very vivid detail the risk that approach presented. But of course, it's also important to the risks about trying to implement exams were, I think quite reasonably, colleges were very aware of the fact that parents were quite likely, in countries that have tried to do this, such as Germany and India, have encountered strong resistance to the idea that it's fair to still try and hold exams. So it's important to recognise there were no easy choices, there were no easy options. We were in a pandemic situation it was a new territory for everybody. But perhaps just come back to you on the appeals issue. Once you've moved to a system where there is effectively no independent, standardised piece of work from the student, that is the key point of reference for identifying their skills and knowledge. We are in a situation that is very, changes the relationship between the appeals, because what is it that you are appealing about? I think we were clear and would, that if you are going to implement a situation of this sort, it does not make sense for the students to be able to appeal the teacher's judgment as to what the grade they would have got, except in the circumstance where they feel that the teacher has basically failed to do the job properly, that the teacher has been biased or has produced a simply unreasonable and unjustifiable grade. In that circumstance, the student does have a right to appeal. But the notion that you could say, I think you got it wrong, I think I would have been a B rather than a C, I do not think that there is any sensible process by which such an appeal could have been heard. But that goes right to the heart of why this whole process ultimately feels unfair to the individual, because they have not had the appropriate degree of agency. They have not been able to take some action.
But it could have been signed off by the head teacher. So if somebody appeals, if a student appealed and they're signed off by the head teacher, surely that would have been a very just way of going forward.
The head teacher had already signed off the... No,
because you were saying you can't have a situation where everyone is allowed to appeal because they've got a C instead of a D or whatever. But if you had a system whereby an individual student wanted to appeal, provided it was signed off by the head teacher, then that surely should work.
If the student appeals and says, we think you got it wrong, the school can simply just contact the exam board and say, I'm sorry, we've made a mistake. We think that we were giving you the wrong information. That wouldn't require an appeal. The school could simply under the mechanism, the school could simply say, yeah, okay, we got that wrong, and inform the exam.
Yeah, I think if it helps, Chair, one of the things that just concerns me about this appeal situation is one of the reasons why predicted grades were not used previously as part of assessment was the recognition that 75% of the time they were wrong, sometimes better and sometimes worse, and that for disadvantaged students, they tended to be predicted worse than they would actually get, and nice middle-class children tended to get more optimistic grades predicted for them. Now, I appreciate centre-assessed grades are different from that, but it just seems to me that saying that only the institution has the right to appeal, you are effectively saying to the institution that it needs to mark its own homework. And a lot of the complaints I'm getting is from students who are saying, effectively, that the school is saying to them, well, we've given you this grade, it's just tough, we're not willing to have a further conversation with you about whether your evidence suggests you would have got a different outcome. And the fact that those students are effectively in that situation left with nowhere to go seems to me inherently unjust.
In a nutshell, Chair, can you answer that in a nutshell?
Well, it goes to the nature of the problem, which is there is not an independent piece of information that can be used to determine between these two competing claims. That's precisely why the lack of any form of standardised test or examination makes this a situation that people find very hard to tolerate.
And you wanted to pass to your colleagues the other questions that David had asked.
I wanted to come back to this question about reliance on final exams. I think it is worth reflecting that situations in which there have been have also struggled to implement a system of calculated grades. So, for example, in all 4 territories of the United Kingdom, attempts to implement and they have different arrangements in terms of final exams. None of these territories have been able to develop a system of calculated grades that commanded public confidence. So I would resist that conclusion. Julie, perhaps you might want to talk about the guidance provided to schools. Also, perhaps I think you perhaps wanted to comment about the statement just made about.
Okay. Yeah. Sorry. Carry on.
Yeah, if I can come in and pick up on a couple of the points, please. Earlier, I was going to come in and explain some of the challenge that we'd had from ministers throughout. So we were meeting with the schools minister on a weekly basis throughout. When we first gave our advice on the options on the 16th of March, which was written for ministers, we did say it would be challenging, if not impossible, to attempt to moderate estimates in a way that is fair for all this year's students. Everybody, I think, throughout the process was aware of the risks. A paper to the General Public Sector Ministerial Implementation Group on the 1st of May highlighted the risk of widespread dissatisfaction with grades awarded from both individual students and schools and colleges, and the risk to public confidence. And then we briefed number 10 on the 7th of August, and again the paper written there was very alert to the risks, both to disadvantaged to outlier students, to centres who had expected improved grades this year, and to the impact on low entry cohorts, including independent schools. So we had been briefing, and we were challenged very clearly throughout on the risks, but it's the lack of alternative that has been the problem throughout. In terms of the appeals, as Roger has said, the real issue is a judgment had to be made on what grade a student would have been most likely to have achieved if they had taken their exams. And we set out guidance for teachers to follow, and it was quite extensive guidance, which we updated as questions came to us. And heads of centre signed off a declaration as they submitted their CAG, saying in their judgment, this was the grade that the student was most likely to have achieved had the exams taken place. Now, it was clear to us from the very start that in the absence of exams, many students would likely think that they would have got a better grade had exams taken place. And many students might have got a better grade, and many might have got a worse grade than their school or college predicted. The difficulty is we will never know, because unfortunately exams had to be cancelled.
Okay, we've got a bit more. Nice. David, do you want to come back at all, David Simmons? David Simmons, can you hear? Okay, do you want to carry on, Julie. Hopefully David can hear what you're saying.
That was provided to school.
Yeah, so I just wanted to pick up on the final suggestion. We've heard this too, that some schools have interpreted the guidance as suggesting that if they hadn't previously had a student who had received an A star, for example, for a subject, they were not allowed to submit a CAG that was an A star. That was certainly not in the guidance at all. We set out the range of evidence that we asked schools and colleges to take into account: students' performance in mocks, in classwork, in homework, in any non-exam assessment. We said that to help them just check the extent to which their predictions were realistic, they might look back at prior performance of their students and the prior attainment of their students and adjust accordingly. But there was absolutely no prohibition on a centre putting in a grade for a student simply because a student in a previous year hadn't achieved that. And the declaration that the head of centre had to make was clear. This was about their judgment of the grade each student would have been most likely to have achieved had the exams taken place.
David Simmons,
right, so,
let's come back.
Yeah, so just so we're absolutely clear, I think, Chairman, that any decision that the grades awarded were simply based on reflecting the prior attainment in that institution. That was a decision taken at the school. It was not a reflection of any guidance that was provided to them by Ofqual.
It was included in the guidance that to help a centre just to sense check its centre assessment grades, that was something they would likely want to take into account. And of course, we did say that it would be taken into account in standardisation. But what we asked centres to do was give their judgment, and it's not easy, on what grade a student would most likely have achieved had the exams taken place.
Okay, thank you. Ian, I'm just going to bring David. Have you finished, David Simmons?
Yep, thank you, Chairman.
Ian Mearns, hadn't finished his line of questioning, so...
Yeah, I really do appreciate this, Chair. I think there are some concerns over the absolute clarity of the Ofqual guidance to schools on centre-assessed grades, and it's clear that the guidance, whether from Ofqual's perspective or not, did give the impression to head teachers and to their staff that they had to be very, very careful and moderate about the grades that they would award to their individual students. So, just for absolute clarity, will Ofqual and the board please release forthwith all school submissions for A-level, AS and GCSEs to a trusted third party such as the Royal Statistical Society, so that a deep forensic analysis can be undertaken to determine how many schools were seeking to game the system, how many were over-optimistic, how many just got it wrong because of Ofqual's guidance, and how many submitted centre-assessed grades were closely in line with no grade inflation guidance. Because unfortunately, all of these things seem to have had an impact not just on centres, but on many, many individual students across centres across the country. And therefore, from that perspective, those individual students who really are in very, very difficult situations do need some answers on that. So we're looking for reliable third-party forensic analysis of everything that's been done, because it's important.
Okay. Can we have a brief answer? Are you going to publish it?
I'm not going to publish it, obviously, because it involves a huge amount of confidential information, but we absolutely, totally agree with what Ian has just suggested. It's absolutely essential that we find there's an enormous amount that we can learn from what has happened over the summer, and that information is contained in the data submitted by schools and the process of standardisation. And it is absolutely essential that independent researchers have access to this in a secure way that will enable those lessons to be learned.
Previously, you said you would publish the minutes of correspondence and meetings with ministers. Will you give us a date when that will happen?
I will need to talk to the department. Obviously, the minutes of ministerial meetings are recorded by the department. I think I'll need to write back to you on that.
Okay, but you'll have your own minutes and papers that you can publish. And so could you, just to confirm, you will publish those for us to see?
Yes, we will. As I say, I will.
Thank you.
The department perhaps.
Yeah. Okay, that's fine.
Chair, lastly, my very last question is about the construction of the algorithms. Who was it that put the guidance in
to actually construct the algorithms in the first place. I understand a dozen what were actually constructed, and you came up with the one which ended us up here. So who actually constructed the guidance for the algorithm? Who constructed the algorithm, and was it outsourced in terms of constructing the algorithm?
Who can answer that briefly? I think Michelle, you want to answer. Yeah. Go ahead.
So we consulted on the principles of the algorithm. That was subject to public consultation in April. We, at the same time, had set up a working group with technical representatives from the exam boards. The decisions taken were ours, but we worked with around 20 different technical experts across the exam boards, and chose then the algorithm that seemed to produce the most accurate results.
And at what point did the algorithm mutate?
I don't believe the algorithm ever mutated.
Tom Hunt, briefly, please.
I'm very interested in the comments you made about possibility of socially distanced exams and how early on that was something you were thinking about. I mean, it seems like Germany obviously did progress with the exams, and from what I've seen, they did it pretty well. There don't seem to have been any major issues. I mean, I think it is. I mean, are Ofqual sort of trying to look into what happened in Germany to sort of learn the lessons to try and make sure that if we do have, if COVID is with us for a while longer, that we can try and eliminate any uncertainty about next year's exams as soon as possible. And finally, do you think, I know this is a bit of a direct question, but do you think on balance it's quite regrettable that we couldn't have progressed with socially distanced exams and we could have avoided a lot of these issues?
I'll just get the chair, Roger, to answer that, please.
We are conducting work right now to learn from international examples. I think particularly the notion around that firstly, there has to be some mechanism by which the individual candidate affects their fate by doing some kind of test of their skills and knowledge seems to us a key learning. Another key learning seems to be that if you can't really replicate your normal exam grades, don't pretend you can. Teacher certificates and other forms of representing the information. Because the objective here was to enable progress. The objective was not necessarily to award GCSE grades. What we needed to do was enable kids to move into university places. That is another key learning. The exam question, precisely how exams, I think it's important to recognise that cannot be considered independently of the degree to which schools are open. So in a situation in which schools have, at the time we were looking at this originally, it was not clear how long schools were going to be closed. Okay. But in a situation where schools are closed for a long time, it does make it difficult to them.
Thank you. Jonathan, can you do this quickly, because I haven't had Christian in yet. So could you just do your questions briefly as possible?
Yes, very briefly, Chair. First of all, I want to quickly go back to the Chair's questions about the testing of this algorithm. Did you run any of the did you run the algorithm on the data that you had before results were released, and therefore did you properly prepare for the process of which kids would want to appeal, and then how did that change after you got direction from the Secretary of State? And secondly, I still don't, my main concern here is that you had teachers ranking kids within grades, and it appears that the larger the cohort, that kind of got ignored. Now, my partner, head of RE, spent 8 hours doing that with her department one day. Why was that ignored when you had large cohorts?
So firstly, to say it was essential to have all that information, and that the actual grading provided by teachers was essential for us to be able to test different types of algorithm and to see how they would work. They formed an important part of the quality assurance process. It was also an important piece of information in determining, for example, this exactly what you're talking about, identifying this question of outlying candidates, where it would appear that the change in grade produced by the algorithm was highly likely a reduction that could not be justified and would need to be overturned on appeal. So the information absolutely was being used. There's been an ongoing discussion about the level of weight that should be placed on the centre assessed grades. Now, the principles that we had consulted on emphasised precision, accuracy of prediction, as being the cornerstone of what we were working for. And it was very clear that the variation between centres in their level of optimism did not reflect real differences in the achievements. It reflected other factors, and we were conducting research with schools to understand how they would put their grades together, and were clear that it would not have improved accuracy to have given greater weight to the centre-assessed grades. Perhaps one final point to say about this, because I think some people have suggested that if we had done that, the results would have been more acceptable. I think it's important to also recognise that that was the sort of approach that was taken in Scotland, and it did not make the results any more acceptable to individuals. But on your specific point about the level of testing that was done, Michelle, perhaps I could hand over to you again, because clearly we...
Briefly, I mean, from what you said before, you didn't do a kind of your own mock to see what would happen and then spend the time rooting out the anomalies.
Well, we did indeed know what the difference would be between the centre assessment grades and those that were produced by the model. We did indeed use a variety of approaches to look for where there were anomalous results. That's how we knew that in total it was about 0.2% of results that were potentially anomalous, and hence we then thought very hard about how best to design the appeals mechanism so that we could deal with those anomalies.
But the appeal system, until the government changed it, was incredibly narrow. It was just based on whether there could be proof of bias or discrimination, something that we raised our concerns about when you appeared before our select committee.
So the appeal system very much did allow a centre to come forward and say, in this year, I have a student here who would be expected to outperform compared to what we see in normal years. The shape of our grades this year, if you like, the grade distribution, will be different this year, and here's some evidence. The appeal system did allow for that.
You had said to us and in your documents that it was based on a bias and discrimination.
Sorry, just to clarify the point, it's the individual student can appeal directly on the basis of bias and discrimination. The individual student, if they believe the moderation process has resulted in them getting the wrong grade, can ask the centre to make that appeal. But crucially, the centre makes the appeal because often what was going to happen was it was more likely that the centre would be the organisation that recognises it happened and would put in the appeal immediately. It wasn't that it didn't rely on the individual.
Okay, Christian, you've been waiting very patiently. Sorry, go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. Obviously, we produced our report back in July, over a month before the A-level results came out. As part of that report, we asked for the statistical model to actually be published so that it could be scrutinised. We asked for that to be done in good time. However, it wasn't published until the actual day of results. So obviously, that didn't add to the transparency of the issue, and if anything, heightened the anxiety of students out there, especially when we looked at some of the criteria. There were some subjects that actually showed themselves with less than 50% accuracy in terms of marks. So at what point did this flag concerns with yourselves that actually there were several subject areas that were anomalous in their own right because of a low level of accuracy?
Michelle, I'll hand over to you in a minute, but perhaps just initially to make the primary constraints on transparency were firstly to not publish information that would influence the way teachers made their assessments. So as soon as the centre assessed grades had been delivered, we published extensive information about how the algorithm would work. The limitation of what we published at that point was that we did not then wish to publish information that would allow individuals to identify the grades that they had been awarded, because the fair process is that all students learn their grades on the same day. So that the final full information could not have been published until the day of results without revealing to some students the grades they had achieved. So those are the fundamental limitations within which we were working. But Michelle, do you want to add any further comments on this?
Yeah, absolutely. So the information that was not published till results day, what was essentially the algebra, and then the definition of what would be a small centre, which indeed we did choose to hold back for the reasons that Roger has just described. In terms of accuracy, yes, accuracy did vary across the subjects. There's a kind of benchmark that is used in assessment evidence that's that any assessment should be accurate for 90% of students, plus or minus one grade, and that's a standard benchmark. And actually, on average, the subjects were doing much better than that. So for A level, we're looking at 98%. For GCSE, we're looking at 96%. So we did take some solace from that, but our aim throughout has been to be transparent about the limitations of the model, and that's exactly, of course, why we did publish those metrics on results day, so that people could understand the limitations of what is possible with any kind of statistical moderation process such as this.
Thank you. I do have a few further questions, Chair. So, I mean, obviously, I think whilst there is obviously a concern about grade inflation, what we saw was a massive scale grade deflation by the algorithm. Roger, one of your own comments earlier in this session was that using the statistical and teacher rankings actually improved the level of fairness. Now, obviously, speaking to a number of students in my own constituency, that clearly wasn't the case. I mean, they would find that statement very hard to believe. And I'm very similar. I think of one local college where I think the accuracy was predicted at 40% being downgraded. I had one college with over 70% of their students being downgraded. Now, that to me showed that there was a clear anomaly in that particular cohort. But then we've all heard horror stories of straight A students coming out with Ds, or in some cases even Us. So to get a U for an exam you've not sat because there were no exams somehow is incomprehensible. But when I've actually seen these kind of assessments from the school, their general reports, and they were getting better results at GCSE than they got in their standardised marks for their A level. I mean, at what point did any of this get flagged up that actually there is a serious issue, and actually, for someone to use that their language, I've got someone else's D because of rankings, when quite clearly looking at it, they were a straight A student for pretty much their entire academic career. This wasn't just the odd anomaly, or I think 0.2% as Michelle raised. This is large cohorts of numbers that didn't slip through the cracks. The cracks gobbled them up in large numbers. It clearly wasn't fit for purpose. And if there was more strenuous testing, as Jonathan highlighted, I don't think we'd be in this mess now. So there is a clear failing at some point, and I just wonder what you think that actual failing was.
I mean, what you seem to be illustrating is a sort of charge of the light brigade mentality, because you knew that there were anomalies according to what you've said to us and in your statement, and yet you carried on regardless because that's what the computer said that you had to do. And I just think Christian, in a brilliant way, has summed up the general injustice and unfairness of the system that you developed.
So I think there's two different points being made, one of which I agree with and one of which I strongly disagree with. The notion that the algorithm was deficient and that somehow a better algorithm would have made this fair, I think is exactly the wrong conclusion to draw from this. I think the evidence that we have presented shows why, and there's two different ideas of fairness here. When I said it improved the fairness, what I mean is it improved, for example, that the likelihood of a specific candidates getting their grades would not depend on the centre that they had been in, and that the differences between different socioeconomic groups were ironed out through the standardisation process. So in that sense, it was fair. And it's important to say, when you say there were large numbers of anomalies, 98% of grades that were awarded were either the teacher assessed grade, which was a majority of them, or were within one grade. So again, it is not true to say that there were very large numbers of large movements in grades that were unjustifiable. There were a very small number, but which we felt could be addressed through the appeals process. So I want to disagree with the notion that this algorithm was not fit for purpose, or that a better algorithm would have produced a different result. But I want to very much strongly agree with your statement that to say this was fair just fails to recognise what happened to students, just the level of accuracy that was fundamentally possible with the information that was available was too low to be acceptable to individuals. And we had recognized this right at the outset. We had identified this as a risk. We knew that there would be candidates who would get a grade that would be probably one down from what the grade they were expected. It would mean they would not have a university place, and that this would strike them as fundamentally unjust. There was the hope that the autumn series would be the response to that, that would give them the chance to prove what they could do. That opportunity receded, which made the acceptance of the grades greatly, much harder. But your suggestion that to say that this was a fair way to award grades to students, it would only have been true if people had been prepared to accept it as the unfortunate consequences of a pandemic in a situation in which there was no other alternatives. And I think quite reasonably people were not prepared to accept that. And that is precisely why I did apologise for.
Okay. Christian, do you want to come back?
I one final question, Chair. Obviously, I'll agree to disagree with you on the algorithm, Roger, and I'm more than happy to invite you to my local sixth form and college to let them explain it much more eloquently than I. My final point is in regards to private students, especially those who are either adult learners or elective home education. Again, we refer to those in our report back in July. And it seems that, again, this is a large cohort which have essentially been ignored. So the only avenue they've got, because there's no centre assessed grade, because there's no centre, so there's no mock exams, is to do the autumn series of exams, in which case they've more than likely, again, have very little input either from a tutor or whatnot. But essentially we're asking them to put their life on hold and be stuck in limbo for an exam which they will sit in the autumn to maybe, if they're lucky, start a university course in January, whereas realistically with larger numbers this year going, it's likely to be next year. So through no fault of their own, they're in limbo for a year with no real avenue to go down.
I have huge sympathy with these people. Clearly they have been some of the people who have lost out most as a result of the decision to cancel exams. I would say, we did work. I'm going to hand over to Julie to say a little bit more about this. Once the decision had been taken to cancel exams, it is very hard to find a solution, and we did explore extensive solutions. But ultimately, there was, the situation was one in which once exams had been cancelled, these people had lost the opportunity to demonstrate their skills and knowledge in a way that would enable them to move forward with their lives. That was the situation we were in, and I agree with you. It's a very tough situation for those people. Julie, do you want to say a little bit more about what we were able to do?
Yeah.
To help
thank you. So again, this is one of the great worries of the model for us, was how to bring in those students who didn't have a relationship with the centre. In the absence of exams, we needed evidence from an exam centre as to the likely performance of a student in those exams had they been able to take place. And for students who had no relationship with the centre, for students who had no work with which a centre was familiar, that was problematic, of course. The exam boards, though, did identify a couple of additional centres who were well versed working with adult learners, distance learners, and the exam boards extended the deadline for the receipt of centre assessment grades to enable, where private candidates did have some work that they could draw upon, to engage with that centre, so that centre would get to know them, could set some additional work for them, and could submit for them a centre assessment grade. It's very difficult to know the precise figures, because private candidates come in many different shapes and forms. They've got different experiences behind them. But the best data we've got suggests that about 3,300 private candidates did get an A-level grade this year. That is fewer than in a normal year, and it does seem that perhaps the group of students who most missed out are perhaps students who would in another year have taken an A-level in a community language, in their language that perhaps they speak at home. They're not taught that language at school, and therefore there would be no work on which their school or college could have drawn. It's been a big worry for us throughout, and it was another reason why we're particularly concerned about the mock appeal route, because that could have been a further disadvantage for private candidates who might not have had recourse to that.
Christian, have you finished?
Yes, Chair.
Okay, thank you. Can I bring in Kim, please, who's been waiting?
Thank you, Chair, and good morning, panel. I have 3 questions, all directed to Michelle. The committee received communication late last night from Cambridge Assessment, and in their communication, they inform us that there were 12 different approaches considered by Ofqual, and that they did offer some assistance, but they weren't asked to review or scrutinise the final form. So how true is it that Gavin Williamson received information about the flaws in grading 2 weeks before the results, and that you gave assurance that this could be managed? Thanks, Michelle.
Thank you for the question. So right from the beginning, when we put together a technical group to work on the model, we had all the exam boards, but additionally technical colleagues from Cambridge Assessment. So colleagues from Cambridge Assessment have been involved throughout and have had opportunity to comment on the model, and actually I have to say have been very helpful in commenting on the model. They also, through OCR, had the opportunity to again raise concerns, in particular at the point at which the design of the model was signed off. So we have an approach where we bring together responsible officers from the exam boards, we sign off final requirements. That was an opportunity for colleagues there to raise concerns. None were raised. And so I just want to be clear about that. In terms of warnings that were discussed 2 weeks before. So this was around anomalous results, so outliers. So Cambridge Assessment had used some of the techniques that we had created and some of their own to identify potential outlier candidates. This conversation was already one that was going on between ourselves and ministers. And you might remember yourselves that, you know, in the public domain, there was debate about students who were, if you like, outliers. So it was very much a live issue. So there was no sense in which they had brought something to our attention that we had ignored. This was an ongoing conversation.
I think some people would disagree with you, like the many who, to our committee, expressed reservations about the algorithm. We know that Sir John Coles was extremely worried about it, and I'm going to come on to him in a bit. And now we know about the Cambridge Assessment Group.
And we did also mention flaws and concerns in our report in July, Michelle. But according to the Prime Minister, the fiasco was caused due to a mutant algorithm, but this has been discussed earlier on in this meeting. However, we have mentioned that your standardisation model did disadvantage certain groups, including high-achieving pupils in centres with lower historical attainment, Black students, and students in centres with larger cohorts. So how did your testing process fail to identify this potential unfairness that appears to be inherent in this model? Thanks, Michelle.
Well, the evidence that we've published, looking at the attainment gaps for example, Black versus white, shows that there is no bias inherent in the model. So I think there's a misunderstanding about what happened with the calculated grades, because if you compare the difference in outcomes for Black versus white students, or indeed students receiving preschool meals versus those not, and you look back to previous years, what you'll see is that there's very, very little difference at all in outcomes for those groups. So there simply isn't evidence in the data of that kind of bias. But I understand that that has been widely misunderstood and misreported.
And I think, we did receive a lot of witness testimony from a number of our meetings where people provided some evidence about those disparities. But it goes on to my question, is that what information has Ofqual collected on the effect of standardisation process by area of the country? And what comparisons do you have between affluent and the most deprived wards?
So you're absolutely right that there were great concerns about potential for bias in this model, and it was a thing that we continually kept under review. You'll remember we put additional guidance out to teachers to support them in making objective judgments, and we always worried that this was something that we were going to have to address, that we would see something in the data that would suggest bias, and then we would have to revisit our previous decision that we wouldn't set differential standards for different groups of students. But actually, the data simply didn't show it, so we didn't need to review that decision, I'm pleased to say. We did publish information about calculated grade by region. That's all in the report that we published on A-level results day. And, we want to make a commitment to publishing further information and data on what the final grades this summer look like, so people can see that by region. And as Roger has outlined, allowing everybody access in a safe way to all the data that we have available, so that people can reassure themselves that there hasn't been some sort of biasing process here.
Thanks, Michelle. And how were errors, including pupils on foundation GCSEs receiving impossibly high standardised grades, missed by Ofqual?
So we took an early decision with regards to tiering. So tiering is, as you'll know, for certain subjects where the span of ability of students is really wide and there's different content to be taught for the most able versus the less able, we have these tiers. And normally what happens is that if a student is entered, for example, into the higher tier and then fails to achieve a grade 3, they fall off, they become ungraded. And for a foundation tier, there are a small number of students each year who are capped effectively. So the most they can do is 5. And this is just a product of the fact that they're put into these separate papers. Well, in the absence of papers this year, we really felt that the fairest thing to do was to remove those limits on students' performance. So there were a very, very small number of cases where, for the tiered qualifications, less than 1% of foundation tier students received higher grades, and for the higher tier, it was less than 0.5% received lower grades than they would normally achieve. But we felt it was actually a decision in favour of students that they wouldn't be constrained in the normal way.
But sorry, Kim, if you can't get more than a grade 5, as I understand it, with these foundation GCSEs, how on earth can you develop a system that allows them to get higher than that? Students? Just answer that simply so people can understand it.
We simply removed the cap that would be normally there, because that cap is an artificial cap. And unfortunately, it's a very difficult decision for teachers whether to enter a borderline student for foundation or higher tier. And sometimes in a normal year, unfortunately, it goes wrong. Students do better than expected or worse than expected. So we wanted to remove that constraint this year so that students were able to get higher grades through the standardisation process. And it did happen in a very, very small number of cases.
Thanks, Michelle. Final question. I just wanted to know whether an equality impact assessment was undertaken in terms of the process that you went down. And if so, would it be possible to publish it? Thank you.
Yes, an equalities impact assessment was done throughout for our various decisions. So they have been published So we've published one in association with the entirety of the process, so collecting centre assessment grades and the standardisation process. And then, of course, there's been a great deal of equalities work actually as part of developing the model, which again is published in our technical report.
Thanks, Michelle. They're all my questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Kim. Tom? You wanted to ask about BTEC, so have you unmute yourself?
Okay. Yeah. Is it okay? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. This is to Michelle. Students had to wait for days for their BTEC results at very short notice. Do you agree with the decision to award these qualifications in line with CAGs, as happened with A-levels and GCSEs, or do you think the standardised grades would have been fair?
I think it's fair to say that public confidence and rebuilding public confidence in grades this year has been absolutely paramount. So we can understand Pearson's decision to want to revisit those grades, because what we wouldn't want is a sense of unfairness developing between those students who took BTEC qualifications and those students that took A-level qualifications. So in light of building that confidence, not wanting that sense of unfairness, I think we were happy that Pearson took this decision. It was a decision for Pearson rather than for us. It was something that they wanted to do.
Well, they de facto had to do, because of what had happened across the board with other exams, in order to ensure a level playing field.
I can see why that was a sensible thing to do, yes.
Jonathan Glenys.
Thank you, Chair. Look, in places like Stoke-on-Trent, where we have a high number of BTEC students, I just need to get across to you the anger and disappointment that when I rock up to schools on results day for GCSEs, and I'm speaking to A-level students, and they're having to have special things put next to their BTEC grade, which is to be confirmed or slips inserted, it just makes a mockery. And again, I appreciate Pearson have questions to answer here, but Ofqual, I need to know really, and Michelle or Roger really, how much consultation was done with Pearson regarding the use of the algorithm, and then subsequent following the U-turn, how much information and one-on-one conversations did you have with them in the build-up to their decision? Because it seems mad to me that they made the decision to pull results at 5 p.m. the day before the GCSE results went out, which caused huge upset and anger.
And on the day, you sort of, if I can speak to the chair, the day that you made your U-turn announcement, BTECs was almost like an afterthought. There's a little line about BTECs. And I just thought, my impression was it was a classic situation of the way we regard vocational qualifications in our country, that they're forgotten about. And even though it was 450,000 students affected, because you were also concentrating on the GCSEs and A-levels, and you took your eye off the ball when it came to dealing with the BTEC problem that inevitably would happen once you'd done the U-turn. Chair, do you want to answer both the points from Jonathan and myself?
Firstly, I do want to just say I fully agree with the view that this was not acceptable for BTEC students to be put in that situation. I fully recognise that. I just also perhaps want to clarify that there was a huge difference between the way that vocational qualifications work and general qualifications work.
No, but no one is doubting that. Everyone knows that there is a massive difference. What the issue was, it would inevitably lead that there would have to be a change because of what had happened, because of the domino effect, in essence. And they seemed to be an afterthought and were hardly mentioned at all in all this until it became realised that actually 450,000 students were potentially affected by it.
The 2 points I would take issue with, it was not inevitable that there would be a domino effect, because the use of calculated grades inside the BTEC system it was completely different to what had gone on with general qualifications. These were two completely separate pieces, but that one was one which Ofqual had been closely involved in, and where we did have the authority to make a decision. The second was one that Pearson was responsible, and where we had no authority to determine how they were going to respond to that situation. That was their call. So those are the only points I wanted to explain in terms of how that operates. But I fully acknowledge that the consequence of that was that Pearson did decide to change their course. We understand why they did it, and it then had the consequence of late grades for those students. And I mean, I was obviously pleased that we did manage to get the GCSE results out and the revised A-level results out on the awarding day that week, but obviously that added to the pain for BTEC students who were not able to have their results on that day.
I mean, don't you think Ofqual should apologise to all the BTEC students for what has happened? That they've had to wait longer than anyone else. I think, am I right in saying most of them have got their results last Friday? Is that correct?
Even some of those were delayed, Chair. You know, results day was promised for the 25th, and then results in some ones didn't come out to the 28th. I mean, I think it just sounds like you said earlier, Chair, regarding the statement that we got last night. It ain't us, Gov. It's how it feels like right now.
I'm very happy to apologise for the consequences to BTEC students having to wait. But to be clear, I mean, again, I think you would need, Julie, perhaps you might be able to provide some more detail. My understanding was that the outstanding results were due to the information that Pearson needed to receive in order to be able to issue the results. But Julie, can you give us any more details on where that is?
Yes, there were a few results that were issued later because the information needed to calculate the result was within the centre, and that had to be extracted from the centre. And just because of the way in which BTECs are restricted and the availability of some assessment evidence, it was more complicated for the awarding body to rerun the result than it was for GCSEs. For GCSEs, it was pretty straightforward. They had to replace the calculated grade with the CAG, but there was much more work involved in revising the grades for BTECs, hence the unfortunate delay.
Thank you. Before I bring in Apsana, who's waited a long time, Ian, can you and Caroline, I think you've both got brief questions. Can you do it briefly, Ian? Thank you.
Yeah. It was in response to Kim's question earlier about the bias in the model, and you said that the algorithm wasn't biased, but surely the context that led up to the algorithm had bias within it. You know, the dominance of history of the results in outcomes that are biased. You know, the fact that I understand that key stage 2 results might have even been taken into context. Well, you know, I'm chair of governors of a school which has got half of its pupils, or many of its pupils, with English as a second language, many of whom have come into a primary school late in their primary school life, but then flourish as their English develops in the secondary sector. So that inherently has within it a hidden bias against youngsters for whom English is a second language. And I'm just wondering whether the algorithm could have been tested by running all of the 2019 results through it just to see what happened.
Could perhaps Michelle or Julie answer that question as concisely as possible?
So we did indeed run the 2019 results through the algorithm. That's how we tested its accuracy and how we tested the impact of the standardisation process on centres with varying proportions of students on free school meals, ethnicity, English as an additional language being another thing that we looked at. And we have specifically looked at English as an additional language. And again, there isn't evidence for those students that the process in of itself produced bias. I mean, we have to remember, of course, that all these different groups do perform quite differently in exams in a normal year because of the differences in educational opportunities. And what we've seen this year is that those differences look like they do in previous years. So the process hasn't exacerbated them, but unfortunately, yes, they still do exist.
I just think that if in future you should guard against using key stage 2 results at all, because we've already heard from the Minister in evidence, this Nick Gibb that is, earlier this year, that key stage 2 results are not at all important.
Okay, I think that's an observation, unless you anyone want to comment on that? Chair. you want to comment on that?
I think the one comment perhaps to make about this is that lots of issues have got wrapped together in this whole process, and that the fundamental objective here was to enable students to progress. And one of the issues that in progression is the impact of different educational opportunities on different communities. And Ofqual was attempting to replicate the most likely set of results that would have been achieved, which of course is replicating the consequences of differences in educational opportunity. We were not, and it would not have been appropriate for us, and we did consulting, it would not have been appropriate for us to have attempted to correct that. However, I think things about, just to say about teacher certificates, or just thinking about if we had been addressing the problem of progression rather than the problem of awarding grades, we might have been able to think about this in a different way, which would have perhaps allowed us to think about the fairness of progression given the difference in educational opportunities available to young people.
Okay, if I can bring in Apsana, please.
Thank you, Chair. So my questions are really primarily for Julie. So your guidance in terms of appeals, your guidance doesn't allow centres who issued their CAGs in line with previous performance to revisit these grades. And I just want to know sort of what is your message to students in those centres who may have received relatively lower grades to their peers? And also, what are your views on what David Blow, who is the external advisory group member for Ofqual, has said in terms of calling on the government to allow for centres to resubmit these grades without reference to historical performance?
We recognise the difficulties that some schools and colleges feel that they are now in. So we have heard from some schools and colleges that they were very cautious when they submitted their centre assessment grades, that they took into account the prior performance of students and took into account prior attainment of this year's cohort, and were perhaps more conservative, if you like, less optimistic about the grades they submitted than some neighbouring schools. And I think the concerns of those schools are that other schools and colleges perhaps were much more optimistic in the approach that they took, and that students in other centres have therefore got an advantage that hasn't been given to their students. But of course, it's a moot point whether it is actually an advantage to be given a grade, an inflated grade, a grade that doesn't actually reflect the grade you might have received had you been able to take your exams. We're hearing, for example, concerns coming from some further education colleges and some sixth form colleges that students in centres who were much more optimistic about the grades their students would have achieved have now perhaps, now they've got the centre assessment grades, got grades that indicate a level of ability that isn't actually very accurate, and there are concerns that they might progress onto a course for which they're now ill-equipped. So as with so many aspects of this situation, there are pros and cons, there are advantages and disadvantages to the approach that have been taken. And so I think it's wrong to assume that students in the centres that were more perhaps realistic about the grades their students would have achieved have necessarily been disadvantaged.
Just in terms of, and I think it was sort of mentioned earlier in the meeting, but just for clarification for those that are watching, I think it was mentioned earlier that there was no requirement for schools to pre-moderate CAGs. Is that going to be something that's sort of guaranteed at the point of appeal?
So there was, as we explained, teachers were asked to take into account a whole range of evidence in order to come to an holistic judgment about the grade each individual student would most likely have achieved had they taken their exams. And we did suggest a number of ways by which they could sense check those views, including looking at the prior attainment of their students this year relative to the prior attainment of students in previous years, and the grades that their school or college normally receives. I know that the exam boards are having some discussions with some centres who believe they did make a mistake when they submitted their centre assessment grades, and those are being put through the appeal process where appropriate.
Okay, so just moving on to I want to bring up our report again in July because we raised a number of serious concerns about the process for pupils who are unhappy with their CAGs and the general accessibility of the appeals process itself. Are you collecting data on which students are contesting those grades, and how are you supporting students that have missed out because of their CAG? Now, just to reference, there were a number of things that were mentioned that would be available for pupils and students in the evidence session that we had previously. So just want to know how much of that has been implemented, and if also data is going to be published on that as well.
Yeah. So we were very aware to the concerns that the committee raised in June, and we published student focus information about what to do if they had a concern about their grade, which we updated when the decision was made to rely upon the centre assessment grade. We set out some examples that might help a student understand whether there is something funny about the grade that they've got, or whether it's just, as in any year, a grade with which they're disappointed. We gave them some scenarios to illustrate the types of questions they might be asking of themselves and of their teachers and of the exam board, to help them understand whether there may have been evidence of bias or discrimination. We published that information. I say we updated it when we took the change of position. We also briefed the National Career Service that runs the exams results helpline, who were taking calls, as well as our own staff. And we provided information of the Equalities and Advisory Support Service, who we know have also been taking calls from students who are concerned about their grades. We are having regular check-ins with the exam boards to understand the types of cases that are coming through as appeals presented by schools and colleges, or being raised by individual students as a concern, a complaint about bias or discrimination or other forms of malpractice. So we are talking to them on a very regular basis, and we will be collecting data.
So can you just confirm again that the anonymised data at the conclusion of the appeals process on where appeals have been received will be published? And we've mentioned in our report the breakdown of that data, for example, by type of school attended, geography, gender, ethnicity, FSM eligibility. Can you just confirm that that's going to be published and when?
Yeah, we will be publishing data. I can't yet confirm when, because I don't yet know when the process is going to conclude. And I can't at this moment confirm the granularity of the data which we'll publish. We'll need to come back to you on that.
Okay. One of the pieces of feedback that I got from my constituents, largely of whom we've got a large number of students on free school meals from really poor backgrounds, was that the National Career Service was referring a lot of them to other numbers, other helplines to ring, and that it wasn't really seen as a way in which they could actually get proper advice and guidance on appeals processes themselves. What would you say to that?
I hadn't heard that feedback. We've been talking to the National Career Service. We know they had a high volume of calls. We were getting a high volume of calls. We normally have 2 helpline open. We were running 10 helplines with extended hours around results day to make sure that we could give timely advice to students who had concerns. I'll happily follow that up with the National Career Service to find out more about those concerns.
Thank you. And finally, when we had Sally Collier give us evidence, she did say that she doesn't claim to have any easy answers in terms of the issues around appeals processes and accessibility. But again, giving assurance that students that feel that they've been subject to bias or discrimination would be able to get support, but that they should approach their schools as well. And do you recognise the anxiety that many students and pupils feel that to challenge, obviously, a result that is actually determined by an institution puts them at unease, and to navigate that process is very difficult. And we mentioned specifically that they're not, many pupils are unlikely to approach their MP or to lobby, or speak to lawyers and so forth. We really, at that point, were unconvinced that the process for appealing against grades was going to be fair and accessible, how much more assurance can you give that the support that's being provided is really accessible and is really reaching out to those that need it? Again, I don't have data to support this, but just, looking at my own constituency, people have decided not to appeal because they just don't think that the process is going to be worth going through, especially as, people from ethnic minority backgrounds or sort of socioeconomic backgrounds to just not understand how to navigate through that process.
Yeah, and that's why we spoke to the Equality Advisory Support Service, and they were happy to have their information, their phone lines published in our guidance. And we know that they have received a number of calls, have the exam boards directly, and indeed Ofqual. It's always tricky. I look back at last year's data. Just for A-level results, there were 60,000 challenges in a normal year to the marking of a student's script. And every year, some students are unfortunately disappointed with their grades. And the difficulty I think we have this year is unravelling whether a student is disappointed because something has gone wrong in the way in which their centre assessment grade was determined, or whether a student is disappointed as they are, unfortunately, in the normal course of events. And the scenarios we included in our guidance were intended to help students ask those questions of themselves and of their teachers to help them work through whether something may have gone wrong for them, or whether it was a case as in any other year.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, Chair, can I just ask one more question?
Very, very briefly, because we're running out of time.
Thank you. Just on those with background of SEND, do you have any sort of comments on how they're being supported through appeals processes, and in terms of particularly on sort of inappropriate or appropriate evidence submitted to determine grades?
Yeah, so a couple of examples. We know from the exam boards that some students who would have had a reasonable adjustment when they took their exams have raised concerns that they don't believe that was taken into account by their school or college, and some schools and colleges have confirmed that. And so the exam boards are looking at that as an appeal. In terms of making sure our information was accessible, we have, you may have seen on our website, produced a number of videos in British Sign Language to help BSL users navigate their way through the information. And we also commissioned some easy reader guides to the approach too.
Thank you. Christian, do you have any questions on the next part, or because we may move predominantly to the autumn resets?
I'm happy to move on to the autumn resets, Chair.
Okay, so and Apsana, you finished, is that right? Yeah.
Yes.
So can I just ask you, it was reported, Chair, that you threatened to resign because the Secretary of State didn't sufficiently show confidence in Ofqual. Is that correct or not?
I certainly spoke to the Secretary of State, and I think if the Secretary of State did not have confidence in the regulator, I would definitely need to consider my position. But
yeah. So did you say that to him, that you would you would resign directly?
I certainly felt that if the Secretary of State had no confidence in me, that it would be appropriate for me to consider that. Yes, but we discussed it and resolved that issue.
Okay, thank you. Caroline.
Thank you, Chair. If I start what we've heard so far, it was essentially that once this decision was taken to cancel exams, since 75% of children would in normal circumstances have received lower grades than predicted, that the task that you were given of developing an algorithm to both command broad public support and be fair and feel fair to each individual was nigh on impossible. Students going into year 13 this year, due to sit their A-levels next summer, are really very worried. What are you doing to ensure that students can have a fair system next year which commands broad public support for their assessments?
Julie, if I start off and then perhaps hand over to you, but I think we have been very clear that we think that some form of examination or standardised test or something that gives the student an ability to demonstrate their skills and knowledge is going to be essential to any awarding system that the students regard as fair. We have done some consultation and published the results of that consultation, but I think this is obviously a fast-moving environment, and the impact of the pandemic remains uncertain over the future. So it is something that we are keeping very constantly under review. Julie, do you want to perhaps say anything more specific about that?
Yes, certainly. And of course, with just the exams regulator, so there's a limited amount that we can do in terms of supporting students with their catch-up. But we have given a lot of thought and consulted and had a phenomenal response. Almost 29,000 people responded to our consultation in July on what we could do in terms of the assessments, the bit of the system that was within our control, both to free up teaching time where that is possible and to make sure assessments can take place fairly within public health safeguards. Content for GCSEs, AS and A-levels is of course determined by ministers, and ministers, as I'm sure you will know, have agreed to some changes to content for a couple of GCSE subjects, history, ancient history and English literature. And we have published information about changes to assessment arrangements in other subjects that will free up teaching time, for example, to make the assessments of spoken language in modern foreign languages much less formal. The formality of the assessment, the need to record it, can be quite disruptive to teaching, we know. In the normal course of events, it can be accommodated, but in a climate where every lesson, every hour of teaching is going to matter to students who need to catch up, we thought that that was a concession worth making, allowing, for example, GCSE science students to observe rather than to undertake themselves the practical science. We know from consultation that many...
Julie, could I just ask you to be as concise as possible? These are very, very long answers.
Sorry. Okay, lots of changes to lots of subjects, and then I don't know whether you want to come to the timetable.
Thank you, Caroline.
This is another issue.
Caroline.
So you talked about catch-up there. We know the government's invested £1 billion in tuition for students, and particularly focused on those at disadvantage to get people caught up. But timing, the more time teachers have, as you said, is important. Now, I appreciate that if we delay the exams, you will have to mark them more quickly. But we do have 8 or 9 months to prepare, and you have therefore 8 or 9 months to prepare people for training them to mark exam papers and to put this into place more quickly. How much delay do you think you could put into next year's exams and still have them marked in time?
Sorry, shall I take that one?
Please.
If you say marked in time, if you mean marked to meet the published results days, I think probably one possibly, but it would introduce risks 2 weeks. I think anything more than that would be challenging. One of our particular concerns about delay is the willingness of teachers after an extended period of teaching and having perhaps lost their holidays this year to be willing to mark throughout the summer holidays, which if the exam timetable is shifted back is what would happen. And that is certainly one of the major risks that we can foresee and that we would have to ensure could be mitigated.
People do get paid for marking. It is a reasonably well-paid occupation, often undertaken by retired teachers at home, is it not?
Most markers are actually active teachers. There's an army of teachers recruited each summer, about 50,000. I don't think most teachers would say they do it for the money. They do it to make their contribution to the system. They might be willing next year, but they can't be compelled to do so, although I think there are certainly opportunities to talk about incentives or a way in which schools and colleges could be themselves supported to support their teachers to contribute in that way.
Can I just add in? I mean, we're obviously very conscious of the difficulties, and we're just expressing very clearly what the issues are about delay. But I want to be really clear. We raised it in our initial consultation, and we are very, very conscious of the enormous benefits that would come from delay. So we do recognise the value in trying to find a way of making this work.
And for thank you, Chair. For the exams themselves. At the moment, students are supposed to be a minimum of 1.25 metres apart anyway for exam regulations. Presumably that would have to be, children perhaps have to be 2 metres apart if you're doing a COVID secure exam. What work is being done already to ensure that we can have larger centres or more centres, more places for students to sit exams, more invigilators being trained ready, and also, because it's likely that some children may still be, or young people may still be having to isolate or maybe unwell on the day of the exam, have you considered the prospect of having to produce 2 papers so that those students who are isolated from track and trace at the time of the exam can sit another equally hard exam a couple of weeks down the line?
Can I take that one? It's a really interesting question, because that was in fact our preferred model for this summer, which was to run a normal exam series if that was possible, with a set of extra papers in the expectation that every student, if they were ill during a period, would be able to take at least one paper in each subject from which a grade could be determined. The autumn series will, of course, it will be much smaller than the next summer series, but we have advice through the DfE from Public Health England on the safeguards that will need to be put in place to run the exam safely. We will learn from that, but it's something, of course, that we are very actively considering, and it's something that needs to be taken into account when the timing of the exam period is finalised, because, of course, one approach might be to have a later but condensed exam period, but that then puts pressure on exam accommodation. So those are very much the issues that we are working through, and we'll want to work through with every party who has a part to play in delivering the exam series.
Thank you. Just one more question, if I may, Chair. Just to say, obviously for these students, this is a time of uncertainty. Uncertainty promotes anxiety. When do you expect to be able to tell the students from year 13 what arrangements are going to be in place for their exams next year, even if it is a small range of options and the circumstances in which the different options may be used?
So in terms of changes to be made to the assessments, those have already been announced. In terms of the timetable, it's not a decision for Ofqual alone. It needs to be taken with Wales and Northern Ireland. We need to have a common timetable. We absolutely recognise that the need for some certainty, and we are working with DfE to try and get to conclusions, I would think, within weeks rather than over a period of months. But I say there are a number of parties that need to be involved in that decision.
Just to confirm, you made the case strongly, did you, that the exams would continue to take place in the traditional way? Is that correct?
Yes, we have argued that traditional exams we should be trying to make those happen.
Right, and you made that case strongly to the Secretary of State?
Yes.
Right, okay. Sorry?
And we have published recommendations, we've published guidance on how those exams the various considerations that
could have taken place. Okay, that's very helpful. Jonathan Gullis and Ian have got some questions. Jonathan Gullis.
Thank you very much, Chair. I think Caroline asked some superb questions, and my big concern going forward is that you have an education body of teachers and students who simply do not have confidence in Ofqual right now. And it's very well and good saying that exams will be sat, but what happens where you've got students in local lockdowns where, God forbid, schools have to therefore shut, where other schools don't? I would like to know what work Ofqual are doing with exam boards to make sure exams can be fair, because as we know, teachers teach the curriculum in different stages and different orders, so that will be a challenge. The second challenge will be, what is Plan B? Is Plan B centre assessed grades? Is it a mixture? Is it reintroduction of coursework? Is it a mixture of centre assessed grades and exams? Do you go to multiple choice? You know, there's all these different questions. And I think the chair of the committee made a really good comment I saw in national press, where he said that these decisions have to be made in the autumn half term, the first half term. Now, I'll probably be kind enough to extend until the Christmas break, but if you do not if we do not enter 2021 with a very clear set of directions for teachers, for exam officers, who are, you know, some of the unsung heroes in all this mess, let's be quite frank, and the students, then I'm sorry, then Ofqual has to then have Plan B ready to go, which is likely to probably be centre assessed grades, because as you can imagine, there's lots of year 10 and 13 students who are now in year 11 and 13, who are now calling for the centre assessed grades to be used because they lost 6 months of education.
Just to come in on the back of that briefly, we should have thanked all the exam officers at the beginning of this session for all the work they've done, and the support staff in very difficult circumstances. But also, if God forbid exams can't take place for one reason or another, would one option be to do the teacher centre assessed grades, but to have an independent checker, perhaps a retired teacher, Ofsted inspectors, to check those, that though they think that those grades are fair? Is that feasible?
So just to say, I very much agree with Jonathan's comments about what needs to be achieved, and fully recognise and accept those comments. In terms of a plan B based upon centre assessed grades, our strong view would be to not do that. We do not think that there is a sensible mechanism whereby you can take highly variable evidence from a range of different circumstances and attempt to construct something that is a trustworthy way of discriminating between students on the basis of their knowledge and skills. We do think it is absolutely essential that students are themselves able to take part in some kind of fair comparative test that gives them the ability on a level playing field to demonstrate their skills and knowledge and to be able to influence their own future.
But if the exams can't be done, what then?
That we believe there are mechanisms such as additional papers. There are other mechanisms, including, for example, using online tests. We feel we have enough time to come up with a solution to that problem.
Okay. Thank you. But Ian, just before I bring you in, Tom Hunt had a question ready. Thanks.
Yeah, so just quickly, can I just say how much I welcome your position on that? I think it's absolutely critical that we do have exams next year, and I think we should eliminate any discussion that there won't be. I think the plan A is exams must go ahead, come what may. So I think that's very good that you got that position. Final question: grade inflation. I mean, one of the reasons why the initial approach was taken, is my understanding, was to guard against grade inflation. Are you concerned about the impact of grade inflation, both on those students who took the exams this year and also on future years? And what steps is Ofqual taken to try and guard against the dangers of grade inflation going forward?
We are very conscious of the effects. I mean, in terms of this year's cohort, I think perhaps the main issue to consider is that universities may find they need to provide additional support to candidates, and to, we may see some impact in terms of dropout rates. We hope that doesn't happen, but we think that is something we all need to be alive to and to think very carefully about. The other obvious consequence of this is that because of many students are deferring their places this year, this will have an impact on next year's cohort. And we need to think very carefully about how we handle that in a way that is fair to next year's cohort. I think at this stage what I say is we are very alive to these issues, and we need to build a system for 2021 that addresses exactly the issues you've raised.
Thank you. Ian Mearns.
Thank you, Chair. On that last issue of grade inflation, hasn't a decision been taken, though, to actually award students the centre assessed grade or the result after being run through the algorithm, whichever is higher? And doesn't that build in an element of grade inflation? I mean, is that not the case?
That is correct. However, given that A-level grades had been awarded, we have a basic principle that is, if you are awarded a grade, unless you have actually done something dishonest or cheated or some sort, you do not get downgraded as a result of subsequent events and appeals. That has been a fundamental principle of fairness, which was why the awarding of central assessed grades was done in a way that did not result in anyone having a grade reduced.
I've also had a significant number of people contact me, as I'm sure other members of the committee have as well, putting case studies, questions and individual problems put to me. One set of issues raised by the A-level grading issues group, ALGI for short, head teachers here in the North East across several local authority areas. And I'm just wondering, given all of those questions that I've and scenarios that I've put to me, can I forward them to you for you to look at and give us some responses, please?
Please do. That would be enormously helpful for us to understand the issues that they're facing. And
Chair, lastly, I think as we've gone through today, answers given today have also elicited from the world outside, via email, text, etc., a huge range of additional questions. So we may well be coming back to you, Roger, and Ofqual to get those questions answered.
I do have a few more questions actually that I just wanted to raise the issue of those candidates, whether home educated or adult learners who have no centre to predict or assess their grades. They've kind of been left in no man's land. What are you going to be doing to look after those? I think there are thousands of those people who are affected. What are you doing to help them?
Julie, do you want to?
Yeah, we recognise, and I said earlier, those students have been in a very difficult situation this year. The autumn exam series will be available for them, and that is one reason why we have said that exam boards must make exams available, even if there is only one candidate wanting to take a paper. And
yeah, but those people are, we're talking about those people who are supposed to be predicted or assessed in terms of their grades and have no one, they're not able to do so because they don't have a centre assessed grade. And there are thousands of people affected by this. So what are you going to do to support those individuals and make sure that their grades are predicted or assessed?
I'm sorry, so for students who had a centre assessment grade this year, they have had a grade issued. For private candidates that didn't have a centre.
I'm talking about the private candidates for exams who had no centre to predict or assess their grades and have been left in limbo.
Yes, the autumn exam.
What are you doing to support them? Yeah.
So the autumn exam series will be available to them. The DFE has written to centres setting out their expectations that centres will be welcoming of those students to provide an opportunity for them to take exams within those centres.
So they have to do exams in the autumn. Right, so they're not going to be assessed in any way. Okay. In terms of, I mean, we talked about the many warnings you had about the algorithm, and John Cole, very respected, Sir John Cole, I mean, I've spoken to him on the telephone, and he suggests, he knows I'm raising this with you, that the 300-page document that you produced is a large amount of system level analysis, but very little analysis of the impacts on students in particular types of centre or circumstance. And his question was, in essence, what analysis was done on the impacts of the individuals, such as high achieving individuals in weaker centres?
Michelle, do you want to? I mean, we did a number of analyses. We constructed a number of different ways to think about this. We discussed it with ministers and with the department and shared analyses with the exam boards in order to understand precisely this issue. Michelle, do you want to say anything more about that?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. We did indeed do these analyses, but it's quite right actually that we didn't publish them as part of our report. But I see no reason why we couldn't make that data available now and publish what we did so that people can see the approach that we took.
So you did do the analysis on the impacts on the individual?
For, in particular, looking for, as you described, those students who had centre assessment grades that were, if you like, outlier from the other centre assessment grades within a school or college, and therefore suggested that there was something unique about that individual, and therefore that the model might not work well for them, and therefore exam boards would approach that school and college for a conversation so as to make sure that they're aware of the appeals opportunities. Yes, we did do that analysis, but it's quite right that we've not yet published it.
Did you do any modelling of approaches which are, combine the centre assessed grades and the standardisation model? And if you did, what did this show?
So we, from the outset, in our consultation that we published in April, discussed the balance that should be given in the model to centre assessment grades or the historical data. And we were clear that because of the different approaches taken by different schools and colleges in producing centre assessment grades, the fact that some were far more generous than others, then to actually incorporate into the model and use both sources of evidence in an integrated way was probably going to be less fair. And that was subject to public consultation. However, we did very much look at whether we could use, if you like, the distribution of centre assessment grades, the shape of that distribution, to inform the way in which the model will produce calculated grades for the centre.
So you didn't do the modelling of the approaches combining CAGs and the standardisation model?
We did, but in a very particular form that I'm sorry, I'm probably doing a bad job of describing. But essentially, if a centre was expecting, a particular peak at grade A and then another peak at grade D, we could actually match that distribution of grades through the calculated grades. So we were looking at using both forms of evidence.
Thank you. If I could ask the Chair, Roger, were ministers made aware that any model of this sort, the algorithm, which kept the proportions achieving particular grades stable over time, would inevitably mean large numbers of young people would be undergraded?
Yes, we said right at the outset that there's a certain level of accuracy that is achievable, that's limited by the data available, and that there would inevitably be a group of candidates who would have done better in the exams, who would know in their own mind, and the teachers would feel completely confident they would have done better in the exams, but that we would not be able to identify them. And
how was that made clear to ministers? In letters, meetings, and do you have the minutes of that, do you?
It goes right back to the first paper we wrote on the
right. And how many did you predict that this would happen to?
Michelle, I'm going to hand over to you, but I think what we'd say, given the kind of the levels of accuracy, what we're talking is roughly, I think this is right, Michelle, but correct me if I'm wrong, roughly a third of students would quite like to have a grade which was either just one higher or one lower than that they actually would have received had they taken the exam. It was simply not possible to determine which of them they were. So what we were doing was effectively finding a fair way of distributing that risk across the whole group of students.
Okay, Michelle, if you're going to answer this question, can I just ask you another? Sorry, you went funny on the speaker system. Sorry, Roger.
Sorry, I think I was talking over you.
Yeah. Before you answer that, can I just ask you additionally, Michelle, if you're going to be answering that question, the estimates of predictive accuracy, i.e. the 60% accuracy, assume that schools' rank orderings would be perfectly correct. Would you agree that it's extremely unlikely that a school in a large entry subject would get its rank ordering perfectly correct? And did you consider there was a way of mitigating this?
So what we know from lots of research evidence is that teachers are much more able to accurately rank order than they are to make absolute judgments. But yes, you're absolutely right that there would have been inevitably some degree of error in their rank ordering, but actually teachers are extremely good at it. It's impossible for us to know, of course, without some form of standardised testing, how inaccurate the rank orders would be. On the issue of discussing changes to students' grades and the imperfections of any statistical model, I think I specifically remember during March discussing what we knew from A-level predictions for university entrance, discussing this with department officials and with the minister, that we know from that work that those A-level predictions do tend to be optimistic. So, a third tend to be optimistic from the research evidence and about a sixth are pessimistic. So I think we knew from the outset that there would be large numbers of changes from what the teachers expected. And there are several points at which there are papers and so on where we've set out the risks inherent in the model, whether that be
and how much attention, either you, Michelle, or Roger, did you pay to the warnings of Sir John Cole and others who were very worried about what would happen to the algorithm, and school heads? So there's a whole list of organisations. That's what I'm still not clear about, is whether or not you took. I know you did a consultation, but I'm talking about specifically about the algorithm. When they warned about the algorithm, and you didn't want to publish it in advance, even though we as a committee suggested it, how serious did you take the warnings of someone as credible as Sir John Cole? Maybe you can perhaps ignore the select committee, but Sir John Cole, a serious character, knows what he's doing.
Thank you. First, I just want to stress we certainly didn't ignore the select committee. We did publish details of the algorithm at the earliest opportunity we could. We took John Cole's...
Well, you didn't, because we said you should publish the standardisation model well before, so that people could properly scrutinise it, and then you published it on results day.
Within the constraints that I set out around not enabling people to see their results in advance of results day. But to get to the point of, to take up the point about John Cole, We had a number of conversations with him. We took his comments very seriously. At the time, we're doing a number of tests of different ways of incorporating centre-assessed grades into the final award. This both was considered the issue of is the overall level of generosity something that we thought would reflect a real variation between centres. We felt that didn't. We were then looking at whether the distribution of grades could be incorporated, but it was very clear that these were creating more inaccuracies than accuracies, because the distribution of grades was tended to be influenced far more by knowledge of the.
I mean, the reason for my question is that you had so many warnings from very good people without access to grind, and yet, as I say, like the charge of the Light Brigade, you just went on and on and on. And as a result, we've came to the position that we did.
I disagree with that in two ways. Firstly, I disagree that we just went on. We did not. We stopped and we considered these things very carefully. The second point, and perhaps the more important point, is I think there's some conclusion you're drawing, which is that if the model had been different and had been more in line with what Sir John Cole suggested, we wouldn't be in this difficulty. And I think that is simply not supported by the evidence. And particularly, I would again point to the fact that in Scotland, they did adopt an approach that was much more one of combining the centre assessed grades with the statistical predictions, and these did not produce any greater public acceptability of the results, because the fundamental reason that the results were unacceptable is for the reasons described earlier.
Okay, I'm very happy, by the way, if Dame Glenys answers the next two questions, if you'd like to, because they do. One of the complaints I had from members of the public, schools, and particularly the press, and they tweeted about this, was that when all this happened, basically Ofqual shut themselves down and refused to talk to the media. In fact, Kate Ferguson tweeted about it, a senior journalist on the Sun newspaper, and others. Every single education journalist almost that I spoke to said that it was impossible to get through, and everything seemed to be referred to the department. Why did that happen? And what went wrong with your communication? Shouldn't you have been out there reassuring people rather than sort of hiding away? And also, your former chief exec didn't give any interviews or said nothing publicly before she resigned from her position.
So in the days just before and after the awarding of A-levels, as I have explained, we were in a difficult conversation with the Department for Education, which had announced a new policy with regard to awarding, and were trying to resolve this. The announcement had been made to support public confidence. We were at variance around the best way to introduce this policy, and that we felt very strongly that it would not be helpful for us to be talking to the media until this had been clearly resolved.
But was that not unacceptable? Because everybody was anxious. People read the newspapers. If you are an independent organisation, all of them were referred to the Department for Education. You have, just looking at your organogram, and again, this is something that perhaps, whether I'm not sure, Dame Glenys is very happy to answer. You've got one director of communications, 10 people working under that director of communications. You're just about, according to Ross Kempsell in the Times, about to hire another senior PR person for £80,000 a year. Given you spending all this money on communications, and by the way, I do question whether all that is value for money to the taxpayer. Why on earth did you just sort of hide yourselves away in the sort of Ofqual attic and refuse to reassure anxious parents, the public, and ignore the media across the land who are trying to explain what was going on?
Yes,
if I just say, it's not for me to speak on behalf of the former chief regulator, of course not, but I...
Sorry, Dame Glenys, your sound isn't working very well, I'm afraid. Chair, Roger, do you want to answer? Perhaps the broadcasters, if it's possible to fix that, but Roger.
I would like to give Dame Glenys a chance to answer this, but I do think it's really important that communication has to be you have to be able to effectively address people's anxieties and give them the reassurance they need. that is the fundamental principle that we were seeking to achieve through any.
But you didn't. It was. I think it was genuinely shocking. And I've listened to you fairly, but your refusal to engage with the media, and given all the money you spend on communication officers, we will look at that as a committee at future date. And I don't understand why you're hiring yet another one if you've got 11 of them, or you need another one for 80 grand a year. I think it is pretty poor that you refuse to engage with the public and the media and schools publicly during the controversy, because all it did was sow more confusion. And you say you're independent, but everything was referred to the Department for Education. So it kind of questions your independence if you're only referring things to the DFE.
I don't agree with that. I do think that if we had entered the debate at that point, it would have increased the level of confusion. Often the best PR advice is to not speak until you can speak with authority and clarity. I think that is what we were doing.
Well, I think you should have answered questions even internally to the press, to respected education editors and education correspondents and in the media. I just think that I just genuinely cannot understand why you took that decision, or why your chief executive didn't then go publicly and say sorry very early on when it looked like it was turning into a disaster. Dame Glenys, I don't know if your sound's working.
I hope you can hear me now. Can you, Chair?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
Yes, good. It was just to say that, like you, I have a strong interest in our communications capacity here, and I do have that structure and arrangements under active review, just to assure you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. 11 communications officers sounds a lot for an organisation such as yourself. Yeah.
Just to be clear, a lot of those are fairly junior rank, forgive me, and they are predominantly involved in the production of significant reports.
Well, given that you refer everything to the DFE, Department for Education, you might as well just let the Department for Education handle your press issues. And why you need another one for 80 grand on top of all the others you've got? I just question whether you're... Could I just ask, Caroline, I'll bring you in, and then I have one final question. Caroline has a question.
Thank you. I was going back to the different analysis that you did. My understanding is that there are a number of different exam boards, and for example, when you get a GCSE in maths, it could be an AQA GCSE, an Edexcel GCSE, an iGCSE, but what you get in the paperwork is essentially the same. I also understand that different types of institution, different types of schools are more likely to use the different exam boards. When you were doing your analysis, did you look at that, and did it have any effect on the results?
Schools use IG.
This year, all the data was compiled together so that one model for a subject was run across all exam boards. So it will have made absolutely no difference to a centre which exam board they were with.
Thank you. Just a final question. Given what has transpired, and again, I'm very happy if the new chief exec answers this. Is Ofqual fit for purpose, and should it be brought back into the Department for Education? Perhaps both the chairs could answer. Sorry, the chair and the chief executive. Roger.
Okay, well, Dame Glenys, I'll say a little bit first and then hand over to you. So the first thing I would say is that this year obviously has been a major blow to the confidence in Ofqual. But I would firstly like to just say that over the previous decade since Ofqual was created, we have successfully brought in new GCSEs. We have transformed the regulation of vocational qualifications. We have started to use our regulatory authority to improve the security of examinations, improve the rigor of examinations. We have, prior to this summer, I think, demonstrated the real value of an independent regulatory organisation. Clearly, the organisation's reputation has taken an enormous knock from what has happened this summer. And that is why we have brought in extraordinary arrangements in order to help rebuild confidence in the organisation, including, I'm very pleased to say, the Dame Glenys's agreement to step in as acting chief regulator. Dame Glenys, if I could perhaps you'd like to say some more.
Thank you, Chair. Just to say that I think what we've seen and heard in really an excruciatingly difficult situation this year during a pandemic has shown the importance of an independent regulator, actually. And That's one of the reasons I'm here. I believe in it, and I know there was all-party agreement to the notion that the work of Regulator should be truly independent from government at the time that we were set up.
So you still you believe the organisation is fit for purpose and no reform, any reform needed?
So this is a small organisation. It's doing a very big job. We've spoken mostly about general qualifications today, but there are, 15,000 or so vocational and technical qualifications, 150 awarding bodies that we oversee, and a very large-scale reform programme for vocational and technical as well. We do have very important, very rare skills and expertise here. Yes, we've had, an enormously difficult year, for which I know the organisation is trying to be as open as possible about and as sorry as possible about, but we do have an important job to do, and, we need to get on and be able to do it.
And you're going to have, are you going to make reforms?
There are questions we must ask ourselves about how we got to this position. So you've raised communication of one of the issues, and certainly, we were heads down, I think, trying to do an enormously difficult, if not impossible job. I do think now one of the lessons from this is that, we need to have wider discussions, really, as we face 2021, for example, in relation to timing of results, how these affect the wider system, how it affects higher education, and so on. So there needs to be a broadening of this engagement in an adult way, and we need to continue to play our full part. Yes, I will look at, the way Ofqual works. Of course I will. And if there are any changes needed, I'll put those in play, even as an acting chief regulator.
Both ensuring quality, but also value for money for the taxpayer.
I've got that message loud and clear. Thank you.
Ian, sorry, you've got a question.
Yeah, well, I'm just wondering, therefore, Dame Glenys, if one of the issues that you really should address is this issue where 25% of grades on an annual basis are regarded as being unreliable, either up or down.
Thank you. I'll certainly keep that in mind and look forward to speaking to you about it, Mr. Meadows. It's interesting how much faith we put in examination and the grade that comes out of that. We know from research, as I think Michelle mentioned, that we have faith in them, but they are reliable to one grade either way. So, I think we have great expectations of assessment in this country.
Thank you. I do appreciate you coming and at least being accountable for a very long session of the committee. And at the end of the day, you are public servants, and I wish you all well and appreciate very much that you have been accountable as I've just described. Thank you. Order, order.